I want to begin by being careful about my own title, because I watched China build in months what takes us decades, is a comparison that can be read in ways I do not intend. And the ways I do not intend would make the whole reflection worthless, so let me foreclose them at once. This is not a simple story of China good and the West bad, and it is emphatically not an argument for authoritarianism or centralized control. And I want to be absolutely clear about that from the outset, because the observation about speed is very easily misread as a claim that a system without the frictions of democratic deliberation simply builds better. And that is not my claim, and it is not true, because centralized systems also produce enormous waste and catastrophic errors precisely because they lack the frictions that catch mistakes. What I actually saw was a real difference in the speed of execution, in how fast a thing gets built once it is decided to build it. And this difference is genuine, and it is striking, and it matters enormously. But it is also, as I will argue, part trade-off and part dysfunction and untangling, which is most of the honest work. And the reason the speed gap matters so much, the reason the thumbnail says that gap decides the future, is not that speed alone determines outcomes, but that speed of execution compounds, and a compounded speed advantage becomes a capability advantage that is very hard to close. That is the subject. Not that fast building proves any system superior, but that the velocity of execution compounded over enough cycles turns into a gap that shapes the long run, and that the West's slowness is a mixture of the price of things worth having and genuine sclerosis that is not. Let me be careful, as always, about the two extremes, because this subject pulls people hard toward one of them, and both are wrong. The first extreme is the triumphalist reading, the claim that China's speed proves that centralized control builds better, and that democratic friction is simply a weakness, and this is wrong, both because centralized speed produces its own catastrophic waste, and because the frictions that slow Western building exist in significant part for genuine reasons worth honoring. And the second extreme is the defensive dismissal, the insistence that all of our slowness is principled protection, that every delay reflects a genuine value, that there is no dysfunction in our inability to build, only wisdom. This is also wrong, because some of our slowness is genuine dysfunction, sclerosis, the proliferation of veto points beyond anything protection requires, the loss of the capacity to build even things everyone agrees are needed. The truth is neither triumph nor dismissal. The truth is that the speed gap is real, that it compounds and therefore matters greatly, that it is part trade-off and part dysfunction, and that the interesting and useful work is distinguishing the protective slowness worth keeping from the dysfunctional slowness worth removing, and understanding what the individual can do about speed, regardless of the collective. So let me develop the central insight first, the one that makes the whole thing matter, which is why speed compounds. The difference between building in months and building in decades is not a one-time convenience, not merely the pleasant fact of finishing sooner. It is a compounding advantage, and understanding why is understanding the whole significance of the gap. Here is the mechanism. Speed of execution means faster iteration cycles, and each cycle is a round of build, then learn from what you built, then improve, then build again. And the faster builder completes many more of these cycles in the same period of time. If one builder runs the full loop of build and learn and improve in months, and another takes decades, then over any given stretch of years, the fast builder has run the loop many times, while the slow builder has run it once or twice. And each run of the loop is a round of learning and accumulated capability and improvement. So the fast builder is not merely finishing each project sooner. The fast builder is accumulating capability many times faster because they are running the learning loop many more times. And the accumulated advantage of all those extra cycles compounds. This is the crucial point. The speed differential is not linear. It compounds. Because more cycles means more learning, means more capability, means the ability to run the next cycle even better. And over enough time, a compounded speed advantage becomes a capability gap that is genuinely difficult to close, because the fast builder has not just done more, They have learned more, and the learning is what makes the gap widen rather than stay constant. That is why the gap decides the future, not because speed alone wins, but because compounded speed becomes compounded capability. The principles that determine how speed of execution compounds into capability, how the velocity of iteration turns into a durable advantage over enough cycles, are worth studying deliberately and as a connected whole, and there is a body of work that lays them out carefully called the Naval Codex. It is not a forecast, and it is not a set of tactics. It is a systematic account of the underlying principles that determine who accumulates genuine capability through the compounding of fast iteration, rather than through the slow single cycles that let capability stagnate. If you want to engage with those principles directly, it is linked in the description, and there is a code on the screen you can scan to reach it. And engaging with the principles directly is what matters, because the compounding of speed applies far beyond any single builder, to individuals and enterprises and economies, and the domains it applies to will always be different. Let me describe what I actually saw, because the abstraction needs the concrete experience. I watched things built at a pace that genuinely recalibrated my sense of what is possible, infrastructure completed in the time it would take merely to secure the permissions in the West, and I watched a culture of iteration, of building something and testing it quickly and identifying the failures and correcting them and building the next version, running at a speed and with a comfort that was striking. And the thing that struck me most was not any single fast project, impressive as they were, but the realization of what this speed means when it is compounded across a whole economy over years. It is not a series of individually impressive buildings. It is a compounding accumulation of capability, cycle after cycle, each one adding to the learning and the ecosystem and the accumulated ability to build the next thing faster and better. And this compounding, extended over the years in which it has been running, produces a capability that a slower economy running far fewer cycles does not accumulate at the same rate. I was not watching individual feats. I was watching the compounding of velocity into capability, and it was the compounding, not the feats, that recalibrated my sense of the stakes. Now, let me address why the gap exists, and I want to do this carefully because it is exactly here that the reflection could slide into the authoritarianism claim I reject. The speed gap has real causes, and they are worth naming, honestly. There are fewer veto points, fewer places where a project can be stopped by an objection. There is an accumulated ecosystem that makes fast building possible, because you can build fast only when the supply chain and the expertise and the density are already there, and the density I have described elsewhere is exactly what enables the speed. There is a culture and an incentive structure oriented toward building, and there is a willingness to iterate and to accept imperfection, to ship the imperfect version and improve it rather than perfecting it before building. But I want to be emphatic that this is not the same as saying centralized control is more efficient, and here is why. The very absence of veto points that enables the speed is also the absence of the checks that catch mistakes, and centralized systems, precisely because they can build fast without objection, also build the wrong things fast, at enormous scale, with no mechanism to stop the error until it is complete. The speed is real, but it is not a clean product of the political system, because the same feature that produces the speed produces the waste, and a system that can build a needed thing in months without objection can also build an unneeded thing in months without objection, and both happen. So the speed is not proof of superiority. It is a feature with a shadow, and the shadow is the waste that the absence of friction permits. Let me now develop the trade-off, the reason the West is slow, because this is essential to the honesty of the whole thing, and I do not want it to be a token gesture. The West's slowness is, in significant part, the price of genuine protections, and these protections have real value. The environmental review that slows a project exists because building without it produces real environmental harms. The safety standards that slow construction exist because building without them costs lives. The property rights that slow a project exist because the alternative is the ability to take people's property without their consent. The democratic input, the veto points, the ability of affected people to object exist because the alternative is building things over the objections of the people who must live with them without their consent. These are not arbitrary frictions. They are the institutional expression of genuine values about rights and safety and consent and deliberation, and they slow things down precisely because they insert the checks that these values require. So a large part of the West's slowness is not dysfunction, it is the price of things worth having, and any honest account has to credit this fully, because a system that could build as fast as it wanted over any objection without safety or environmental or property constraints would build fast and would also produce exactly the harms that these protections exist to prevent. The speed gap is in significant part a trade-off, and the trade-off is not obviously one we should want to abandon, because the slowness buys protections that are genuinely valuable. Here I want to connect to the dimension that bears most directly on how you're positioned, because the theme of speed and slowness applies to how fast a system can respond to a shift, and the monetary shift is the clearest case. The West is slow to respond to the monetary trajectory, and this slowness is itself part protection and part dysfunction. The democratic process that prevents rapid unilateral action being partly a genuine safeguard and partly a sclerosis that prevents even needed adjustment, and meanwhile the monetary shift proceeds at its own pace, indifferent to the slowness of the response. And the individual, unlike the slow collective, can respond to the monetary shift quickly, repositioning on their own timeline rather than waiting for a slow system to act. The way capital actually moves as a monetary shift proceeds faster than the system's slow response to it, where it flows and why, and what happens to those who waited for the slow collective response versus those who repositioned quickly on their own is worth understanding in its specific mechanics rather than in vague outline. And there is a framework that traces exactly this, called the Dragon Pivot. Despite the name, it is not really about any single country. It is about how monetary transitions unfold at their own pace while systems respond slowly, and how those who acted with individual speed positioned themselves before the slow collective caught up. You can reach it through the code shown on the screen, or through the link in the description for anyone who wants the fuller picture. And that picture matters here precisely because the shift moves faster than the slow response to it, and the individual who can respond quickly holds an advantage over the system that cannot. Now let me develop the dysfunction, the other side, because not all of our slowness is principled protection, and honesty requires saying so. Some of our slowness is genuine dysfunction, sclerosis, and it is worth naming precisely. It is the proliferation of veto points beyond anything that protection requires, the accumulation of procedural barriers that serve no genuine protective purpose but exist merely because they accumulated and no one removed them. It is the loss of the capacity to build even things that everyone agrees are needed, projects that serve genuine public purposes and harm no one, and are nonetheless delayed for years or decades by process that protects nothing. It is process for its own sake, deliberation that has become avoidance, the multiplication of steps and approvals and reviews far past the point where they add any genuine protection. This is dysfunction, not trade-off, and it is worth fixing, and it is a real cost, because a society that has lost the capacity to build the things it needs, not because of principled protection, but because of accumulated sclerosis, has genuinely degraded, and the degradation is not honored by pretending it is wisdom. And the honest task, the difficult and necessary task, is distinguishing the protective slowness worth keeping from the dysfunctional slowness worth removing, refusing both the triumphalist claim that all friction is weakness and the defensive claim that all friction is wisdom, and doing the hard work of telling the two apart. This brings me to what you actually do, and here is the turn to the individual, because the collective speed gap is largely beyond your control, but speed of execution is something you can cultivate personally. The velocity that compounds into capability is available to the individual regardless of the collective, and the individual who cultivates it holds a genuine and personal advantage. The person who iterates fast, who ships the imperfect version and improves it rather than perfecting it before building, who runs the build and learn and improve loop quickly, accumulates capability faster than slow peers, for exactly the reason the compounding works at the collective level, that more cycles means more learning, means a widening capability gap. And this personal velocity is entirely within your power, because it does not depend on the political system or the collective. It depends on your own willingness to iterate fast, to accept imperfection, to run the loop quickly rather than deliberating endlessly. And in positioning, this means both owning genuine productive capability and cultivating the personal speed of execution that compounds it, running your own iteration loops fast while the slow collective deliberates. The work of building genuine productive capability and cultivating the personal velocity that compounds it, running fast iteration loops while the slow collective deliberates, is worth doing systematically. And there is a framework devoted precisely to that called the Sovereign Vault. It is concerned with building durable, generationally significant wealth grounded in real productive assets and real capability, the kind that compounds through fast execution rather than stagnating through slow single cycles, rather than in the fragile arrangements that a slow and deliberative approach mistakes for prudence. It is linked below, and the code on the screen will take you straight to it for anyone who wants to go deeper on the question of how to build capability through velocity. And that is the practical core of it, because understanding that speed compounds means little if you do not cultivate the personal velocity that lets you compound it. Now I want to spend real time on the even-handedness, because it is where the honesty of the reflection is tested, and the speed comparison makes it especially necessary. The speed gap matters, and it compounds, but it does not guarantee that China wins, and I want to develop why substantially. Speed is powerful, but it is not sufficient, because building fast is not the same as building the right things, and fast building can compound errors as well as capability. The same velocity that builds needed infrastructure fast also builds unneeded things fast, the ghost cities, the property overbuilding, the enormous misallocations that fast building without checks produces, and these are the compounding of waste, not capability, the shadow of the speed I described earlier. So the compounding of velocity cuts both ways, and a system that builds fast without the checks that catch errors compounds its mistakes as fast as its successes, and China's real vulnerabilities in its property sector and elsewhere are in significant part the compounded waste of fast building without adequate checks. And the West's genuine strengths do not depend on construction speed at all. The innovation ecosystem, the frontier research, the entrepreneurial dynamism, the capital markets, these are formidable and durable, and they are not a function of how fast infrastructure gets built, so that the speed gap in construction, real as it is, does not touch the domains where the West's deepest strengths lie. So that gap decides the future is true in the specific sense that compounded speed becomes compounded capability, and false if read as the claim that China's construction speed means it wins everything, because speed compounds waste as well as capability, and the West's strengths lie substantially in domains that construction speed does not determine. I want to think honestly about why the West lost its speed and why individuals are slow, because understanding the mechanism is the only defense against it. The collective lost speed through the accumulation of veto points, each one added for a reason, many of them good reasons, but accumulating past the point where the sum protects anything and into the point where it merely prevents, and through the loss of a building culture, the fading of the orientation toward building that once made fast construction normal, and through the comfort that reduces urgency, the prosperity that makes the slow pace feel acceptable, because there is no pressure forcing speed. And individuals are slow for reasons that mirror this, the perfectionism that refuses to ship the imperfect version, the fear of building something flawed and being judged for it, the deliberation that feels responsible but is very often avoidance, the comfort of planning over doing, of the endless preparation that never has to face the test of a real build. And these reasons at both levels explain why speed is so hard to cultivate even when its value is understood, because the veto points and the lost culture and the comfort push the collective towards slowness, and the perfectionism and the fear and the comfort of planning push the individual towards slowness. And the compounding advantage of speed is foregone, cycle after uncompleted cycle, in favor of the deliberation that feels safe. I want to be very clear one final time about what I am not saying, because the misreadings here are dangerous and I want to foreclose them completely. Bills in months, what takes us decades, is not an argument that authoritarianism is more efficient, and I reject that explicitly, because centralized speed produces its own catastrophic waste. Building the wrong things fast at enormous scale with no check to stop the error. And it is not a claim that China wins, because speed compounds waste as well as capability, and the West's deepest strengths do not depend on construction speed. And it is not a claim that all of our slowness is dysfunction, because much of it is principled protection worth keeping, the price of safety and rights and consent and deliberation. And it is not essentialism, not a claim about any people. It is an analysis of speed and its compounding and the mixture of trade-off and dysfunction in slowness. And it is not doom or triumphalism or panic, because the appropriate response is not fear, but the calm work of distinguishing the protective slowness from the dysfunctional and the cultivation of personal velocity, which is a constructive and improving act. So I want to end, as I always do, not with an exhortation, but with an invitation to see clearly, because this is, in the end, one of the oldest truths there is about capability, and it is not new. Speed of execution compounds, and the gap between the fast builder and the slow one widens over cycles, because more cycles means more learning, means more capability, and a compounded speed advantage becomes a capability advantage that is hard to close. This is not new. What is new is only the specific circumstance, a particular difference in the velocity of building, compounding across an economy over years, and a particular Western slowness that mixes genuine protection with genuine dysfunction, and the particular task of telling the two apart, and the particular fact that the individual can cultivate personal velocity regardless of the collective. That gap decides the future, not because speed alone determines outcomes, but because compounded speed becomes compounded capability. And whether you cultivate personal velocity, whether you run your own iteration loops fast while the slow collective deliberates, is the thing in your control. Cultivate the speed that compounds. Ship the imperfect version and improve it. Run the loop quickly and distinguish in the collective the protective slowness worth keeping from the dysfunctional slowness worth removing, honoring both the values that some friction protects and the honest recognition that some friction protects nothing. And the value of that velocity, of the compounding of fast cycles into capability, invisible for a long time, the way these things always are, through the stretch in which the slow deliberator appears merely more careful and the fast iterator appears merely reckless, reveals itself the way compounding always reveals itself, which is slowly in the quiet accumulation of capability through cycle after completed cycle, and then suddenly, at the moment the accumulated capability gap between the fast and the slow becomes undeniable, and the ones who cultivated velocity, who ran the loop while others deliberated, are found to have been all along simply the ones who understood that speed compounded becomes capability.